Hi, this is Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. The transformation in Shauna was amazing. The days with Mother Tamalina and Father James quickly faded into an old nightmare. Children are astonishing in that respect, able to flourish after a terrible ordeal. She no longer clung to Jo Beth's skirts. Shauna thrived in the love and affection showered on her by the group. She went everywhere with Tamara and the boys. She loved fishing with Carter and Todd for dinner or collecting wood with Adam and Jonah. The boys would take her into town to the local store and buy her candy and ribbons for her well-kept hair. Shauna's small face would light up with joy as she sucked reverently on a piece of candy. She was no longer the pale shell of a child, but a rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed girl. Jonah loved to throw Shauna high into the air, catching her safely in his strong arms. Jo Beth smiled as she sat in the tall green grass, watching as Shauna let out full-belly giggles. Everyone loved her. She was an inspiration to them all. Maybe it was because so many of them had been alone when they were her age. Or maybe it was simply they needed to protect the 5-year-old from the hurt they had experienced. Whatever the reason, Shauna was the inspiration for the small group of teenagers to fix up the old house, to make it a home. A child shouldn't live in a shack, especially one about to fall in on itself, Alan announced one evening about 2 weeks after Jo Beth and Shauna had come to live with them. He directed his speech to everyone as he stood up from the tattered dinner table. Secretly, he wanted a nice home for both Shauna and Jo Beth. "I agree," Tamara said with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She pushed herself away from the table, leaving her half-eaten stew. Everyone turned to her, surprised. Tamara's affection toward Shauna continued to amaze the boys. This warm, tender spirit was not the girl they knew. "And she needs clothes. I could sew her some pretty dresses if I had some material." "We'll get some," Alan said firmly, placing his hands on the table while carefully avoiding splinters. "We'll get some material so all the girls can have new dresses." Tamara's head snapped up in response to Alan. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She had longed for new dresses for some time, but no one had seemed to notice. "And apples," Jonah smiled, bouncing Shauna on his lap. "I wants to plant an apple tree right in the front, so's me and Shauna can pick an apple for breakfast every morning." "Well, Jonah," Alan chuckled, feeling proud of himself. "I'll leave the planting to you." "That's just fine by me." Jonah smacked the palm of his hand on his free leg. "We'll have a great big old tree dripping with fat, juicy apples."
"Yummy!"
squealed Shauna as she hugged Jonah round the neck, her white face pressed firmly onto Jonah's dark one. She looked like the porcelain doll Adam brought home one afternoon. It was a beautiful doll that resembled Shauna, with long blonde hair as soft as silk and bright blue eyes that closed when you laid her down. She had a dress of royal blue velvet that billowed around her porcelain knees. The dress was trimmed in white lace, and matching blue ribbons went in her hair. The doll must have cost a fortune, which Jo Beth knew Adam did not have. She could not help wondering how he had been able to get the beautiful doll for the child who had never owned anything so extraordinary before in her life.
"I'm naming her Donna,"
Shauna squealed, kissing Adam squarely on his cheek. Jo Beth swallowed the lump growing in her throat. It did not matter how Adam got the doll. Shauna deserved it. She thanked him kindly, causing him to blush a crimson red. They all seemed to shower the little girl with gifts. On another day, Alan brought home an old small trunk. He sanded it down and gave it to Shauna to keep her dolls and their clothes in. Shauna had never had anything so beautiful. She touched the smooth surface and began to cry softly.
"Thank you, Alan,"
the child said and hugged him around the waist tightly. Alan stiffened, unsure how to react to the child's affection. but her thin little arms felt so warm and trusting that he relaxed and hugged her back. As the days passed, Tamara and JoBeth slowly became friends, if not close friends. True to his word, Alan bought material for JoBeth and Tamara. They made clothes together, and JoBeth had to admit that Tamara was an excellent seamstress. She fashioned Shauna the prettiest dresses JoBeth had ever seen, with matching ribbons to go in her hair. JoBeth loved seeing Shauna prance around in her new frocks, ribbons bouncing in 2 long braids down her back. Tamara would clap her hands with glee while Shauna would twirl around and around, her petticoats flying high. JoBeth could not help loving her own dresses. She made high-collared puff-sleeve dresses that were a little extravagant, but it had been so long since she had anything nice, let alone new, that she could not hold back from the latest styles. Tamara's dresses were very low-cut and exposed most of her cleavage. JoBeth was mortified when Tamara returned home with a small bottle of red dye. She intended to dye her beautiful, modest blue dress a brilliant red. JoBeth could not help wondering where Tamara had acquired her flamboyant taste. All 3 girls blossomed in the glory of their new apparel. The boys had to admit that the women of the house looked too classy for a bunch of scallywag boys. JoBeth liked living with the boys and Tamara. They were not her parents and Polly, but they were the next best thing. She tried to disregard the time spent with the Johnstons. She did not want to destroy the small comforts she had escaped to. It was a hot early morning, and JoBeth and Tamara were busy washing their clothes in the lake when JoBeth's head began to swim dizzily. She stopped scrubbing Alan's shirt on a rock and wiped her sweaty brow with the back of her hand.
Another spill?
Tamara asked offhandedly, her hands never stopping scrubbing. She did not want to sound concerned. Since the first day Tamara and JoBeth had locked horns, Tamara had witnessed the thin girl trying to hide her sickness more than once. Even though she hated to admit it, she had become fond of JoBeth. She was beginning to get worried. JoBeth was the only girlfriend she had ever had. Huh? JoBeth had forgotten Tamara was beside her. Oh, yes.
Well, I think it's time for a doctor,
Tamara said, casually banging Oliver's slacks across the rocks.
Damn soap. Can never get this crap out of the clothes.
JoBeth smiled weakly. Tamara's cursing did not offend her any longer. She found the other girls' outbursts amusing. Here, give them to me. JoBeth reached out for the pants and began wringing the soap out. You can cook up a storm and sew better than anyone I have ever seen, but you are the worst clothes washer in history. JoBeth breathed, trying to ignore the waves of dizziness.
Well, we can't all be perfect,
Tamara scowled, grabbing one of Shauna's soiled dresses from the basket of dirty clothes. She fingered the dress absently, stealing a quick glance at JoBeth.
You think I sew well?
Yes, the very best. Fighting back the wooziness. You could be a seamstress.
You don't look so good.
JoBeth's skin had become colorless.
Thanks.
Remind me never to give you a compliment again. She wiped loose strands of her bun from her sweaty face.
No, you look sick.
Tamara dipped the dress into the cool water. JoBeth stopped scrubbing and turned to see Shauna's pigtailed head bent over her dolls in the grass nearby. Well, I have to admit, I have not felt quite like myself lately, she confided, her eyes downcast. Her hands in her lap were wet and soapy, and she began to rub them on her skirt to dry them.
You know,
Tamara tittered, slapping her hands on JoBeth's back,
if you weren't such a goody two-shoes, I'd think you was in the family way.
JoBeth clutched the other girl's arm as the blood drained from her face. Tamara drew back as JoBeth's pale face turned an even ghastlier white.
I was just fooling.
She grabbed a rag from the pile of clean clothes and dampened it in the stream, placing it on Jo Beth's fevered brow. Jo Beth looked at Tamara's fearful face. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and everything went black. "Jo Beth! Jo Beth!" She could feel someone tapping her face, but Jo Beth would not open her eyes. Distracted by the commotion, Shauna put her dolls down and went to the stream where Tamara was hovering over Jo Beth. Patting Tamara's shoulder, Shauna asked, "What's wrong with Jo Beth?" She felt her spine tingle with fear. Jo Beth looked like she was sleeping, but the panic rising from Tamara reminded her of Donna and how she had gone to sleep and never woke up. "Go get someone quick!" Tamara did not know what to do, and she was as frightened as the platinum-haired child. Shauna stood frozen on the spot, not moving, her eyes fixed on Jo Beth's gray face. In a panic, Tamara screamed, "Move it! Quick!" In a flash, Shauna scrambled up the hill as fast as her little legs could carry her. Jonah and Alan were outside testing the new steps they had just built. "Very good, my old friend, if I do say so myself." Alan patted Jonah's shoulder proudly. "Not bad, not bad," Jonah replied, hooking his thumbs into his suspenders. Running up the hill madly, Shauna spotted them. "Alan! Jonah!" She heaved, trying to catch her breath. They turned, surprised to see Shauna's flushed face. Jonah bent down to the exhausted girl. "Slow down, little one. What's the matter?" "Jo Beth!" "What about her?" Alan jumped in, his heart starting to beat fast. He looked where Shauna had come from and could see nothing. "At the lake, she is sleeping and won't get up." Shauna finally spit out, bent over, trying to suck air into her lungs. Jonah gently shook Shauna's hand in his large one. "You show us where she is, all right, sweetheart? You done a good job so far, but you gots to show us where Jo Beth is." He glanced up to Alan, hoping he had been listening to him. He was aware of Alan's feelings for Jo Beth and did not want him to fly off the handle. Alan paid no attention to Jonah as he impatiently shifted from one leg to the other. Shauna, her breath coming back to her, pulled at Jonah's hand and led him back to Jo Beth. The lake was only down a small hill behind the house, and within moments they were beside Tamara and Jo Beth, who was still unconscious. Alan rushed to them and quickly scooped Jo Beth's frail body in his arms. She had gained some weight since living with them, but she was still as light as a feather. He whispered her name into her ear and felt her warm breath against his cheek as her head rested on his shoulder. A mumble escaped her lips as she stirred. "She's waking up," Alan called over his shoulder to the relief of the three others. "Jo Beth, it's Alan. Wake up." Weak as a kitten, she lifted her head from his comforting shoulder. Her eyes squinted against the bright sun as she tried to open them. "Alan?" "Yes." His voice was husky, and it felt trapped in his throat. "What happened?" Jo Beth looked around her. The last thing she remembered was washing clothes with Tamara. Tamara bent over Jo Beth's pale face, relieved she was alive. "You fainted. Never had anyone faint on account of my bad mouth." Jo Beth felt ridiculous. She looked up at Alan, abashed, and struggled to sit up. "I'm so sorry," she said, feebly trying to compose herself. "Are you all right?" His voice was filled with emotion. The smell of Jo Beth's hair, crisp and clean like the lake, lingered in his nostrils. He wanted to hold her light brown locks up to his nose and inhale deeply. She tore at his heart. A desolate feeling swept over him. He wouldn't know what to do if anything happened to her. Jo Beth felt overwhelmed and ashamed as she looked into Alan's strange green eyes. Genuine concern for her welfare flooded through him. "I am fine," she murmured, avoiding his feline eyes. Feeling undeserving of Alan's affection, she stood up. She was not worthy of being cared for by anyone, not with the realization of what was wrong with her. It all made sense. Her recurring sickness and dizziness, her missed monthlies. How long had it been since she had menstruated? At least 3 months. Her waist had been slowly disappearing. How could she not know? Mama had explained what happened to a woman when she was to become a mother. Why had JoBeth not known? Tamara had guessed but dismissed the very notion because she believed JoBeth to be pure. She had been wrong about her. "Let's bring our sick girl to the house," Jonah said, hovering behind Alan like a mother hen. Alan nodded and held on firmly to JoBeth's shaking arms. "No, I'm able to finish my chores. Let me go, please." She pulled away abruptly. Alan flinched, aware of how close he was to her.
JoBeth, I can do the wash fine by myself. I was doing it alone for a long time,"
Tamara said, afraid JoBeth would faint again. JoBeth stood up straight, her legs feeling wobbly. She walked over to Shauna and gave her a reassuring pat on the head. "I am fine. It was just the heat," she said, not facing the worried people in front of her. "I will not lie down when there is work to be done. Quit worrying about me and get back to your own chores." She walked to the laundry and grabbed the garment she had been cleaning before she fainted, continuing where she had left off, not daring to look at the open-mouthed group behind her. Tamara looked at JoBeth in disbelief. She shrugged her shoulders at Alan and Jonah, who stood bewildered.
"You heard her. Back to work,"
Tamara squawked, shooing the 2 baffled boys away. Not knowing what to do or how to protest, they reluctantly turned around and began to ascend the hill. Tamara returned to smacking clothes on the rocks, glancing every few minutes back at JoBeth. "Stop mothering over me," she said without pausing for a break. Satisfied that JoBeth was all right, Shauna turned back to her dolls. She gently sat down on her quilt littered with porcelain babies and was instantly lost in her make-believe land once again. Tamara bent her head down low and sneaked a peek out of the corner of her eye.
"I ain't mothering no one."
"Could have fooled me," JoBeth sniffed, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She attacked the garment she was washing with fervor. Tamara raised her eyebrow but pretended not to hear as she went about her duties. Both girls continued to work in silence. JoBeth felt Tamara's eyes burning into her back. Guilt flooded her entire body. The heat of her eyes burned straight to JoBeth's flat belly. It felt hot and heavy. Could everyone tell she was with child? She thought of Alan's round face full of concern. She banged the piece of clothing harder onto the rock, trying to beat out the frustration she felt. A savage scream filled her mind, causing her to slump over, exhausted. She stared down at the beaten shirt, unable to swallow this new discovery. She did not want to leave the people she had come to love in the last 2 months. There was no way she could rip Shauna from the only family she had ever known. JoBeth pressed her fingers to her temples and squeezed. She could see no other alternative. She turned to watch as Shauna played, content with her dolls, unaware of the change about to take place. Her cheeks radiated color and health. Her voice tinkled on the wind with the sound of innocence and childhood, a childhood Shauna finally had, deserved. Was it fair to remove the child from her new home? JoBeth's throat tightened. She could not take Shauna with her. The little girl's childhood couldn't be stolen from her again. Pain tore at her heart, and her chest felt like it would cave in. Life would be unbearable without her. A tear trickled down her face, and JoBeth wiped it away unconsciously. She would never be happy again. Clouds floated lazily in the light blue sky as she gazed up. Her life was over, and yet the day was beautiful. Her eyes went longingly to the hill and the house she now called home. She squinted, shielding her vision with her hand. A lone figure was running towards them. Jo Beth stood up and looked closer. It was Jonah with a look of dread on his face. He stumbled to the ground and jumped up, brushing the dust off himself. Jonah was yelling something, but Jo Beth could not understand what he was trying to say. Tamara, who was now standing, looked at her, confused.
What the hell is wrong with him?
The sheriff! The sheriff! They's after us! They's after us!
Jonah yelled, coming closer. Tamara started walking towards Jonah, but stopped in her tracks upon hearing the words come out of his mouth. Jonah finally reached them, panting as he bent over, supporting himself on Tamara's shoulder. She grabbed him under the arm to keep him from falling onto his face.
What are you talking about?
Jo Beth asked, lifting Shauna up onto her hip as she ran to her.
The sheriff,
Jonah panted.
They found us out.
He looked as though someone had poured a bucket of ice-cold water on his head.
Old man Willard caught us stealing at the store today. Todd and Oliver got away from him, but he got the sheriff after us.
He stopped and looked at Tamara. His friendly ginger eyes were wide with fear.
We gotta split.
He began to shiver. Tamara placed her arm around him protectively.
And you knows what'll happen to me,
he said, wide-eyed. Tamara frowned.
I am hung. Old man Willard said it before, and I'll bet you I will. I will.
Damn it to hell!
Tamara's old voice boomed. Whimpering sounds escaped Jonah's trembling lips.
I don't want Jonah to hang.
Shauna crushed her pale fist into her eyes. Jo Beth felt helpless. She did not want Jonah to hang either. Feeling as though the wind were let out of her sails, she began to gather the clothes up into a heap. Everything was moving fast. Her mind whirled, trying to absorb all of the new information flooding it.
Don't just stand there like you don't have a brain in your head. Move, Jo Beth, move!
Tamara grabbed the damp clothes clutched tightly into Jo Beth's arm.
Get Shauna's dolls and stuff into her trunk and get to the house.
Relieved to be given direction, Jo Beth jumped into action. Anxious faces turned to the lone figure standing in the kitchen. Light filtered through the windows, giving Adam an ominous glow.
All right, he said calmly. Here's what we'll do. The sheriff will be looking for a large group of us. If we're all together, we could be caught like a coyote in a chicken coop.
Jo Beth felt as though she were being torn apart. All her turmoil over what to do about her pregnancy was for nothing. She was going to have to leave her new family anyway. Grief filled her heart and soul as she fought the urge to cry. All their belongings were quickly packed and tied to their backs in makeshift packs. It had taken only minutes to get their meager belongings together.
We will have to split up,
Adam finally revealed. He twisted his cap in his hands nervously. Shuffling his feet, he spoke to the dirty ground, unable to look at anyone. It'll be Todd, Carter, and me, Tamara, and Oliver. Last, Ellen, Jonah, Jo Beth, and Shauna will be together. Nobody will be alone. When it's possible, we'll get together again.
Where?
Yelled Tamara, standing beside Oliver and looking as though she might cry. Oliver looked miserable as he placed a hand on her shoulder in comfort.
Hell, Tamara, I don't know,
Adam choked, running his hand through his sandy blonde hair.
What you really mean is we isn't ever gonna see each other again,
Tamara cried. Massive tears fell freely from her ebony eyes.
Yes, we will,
Adam stammered, uncertain if he spoke the truth. He had never seen Tamara cry or look so vulnerable. The effect was quite unsettling, and he could not look at the beautiful, red-eyed girl without wanting to cry too. For the first time, Tamara looked like an angel sent straight from heaven with all the sorrows of the world on her feathered shoulders.
All I know is we have to. God help us. But we can't be worrying about that now. We gotta get out of here fast.
He went and stood beside Carter, who was staring at the ground, kicking dirt angrily with the toe of his boot. Oliver encircled Tamara in his arms as she willingly succumbed, sobbing hard.
We're gonna be all right, Tamara.
he whispered, brushing his hand through her silky curls.
I'll take care of you. Don't worry.
Tamara sobbed and hugged Oliver closer.
Everything's gonna be all right,
he said without conviction as he saw the look of despair on his fellow friends' faces. It was written just as plainly on their faces as if it had been printed in the newspaper. The likelihood of them ever seeing each other again was doubtful. Jo Beth shifted the weight of her sack. It was slightly heavier than when she had arrived 3 months earlier with only the clothing on her back. She shivered and squeezed Shauna's hand. Would she ever see her new friends again? At least she had Alan and Jonah with her this time. She would not be alone with the responsibilities. The thought of the baby she was carrying flashed through her mind like a hurricane. She quickly erased it. For the moment, there were more important things to worry about. They ran as fast as they could from the others who had, just a short time ago, been part of them. The 3 groups separated and went in different directions. Jo Beth turned toward the path in which Tamara and Oliver ran. Their hands were clasped together. Tamara's jet-black hair streamed out behind them. The image quickly faded. Soon, all she could see were 2 black dots.
Why do I always lose the people I love?
Jo Beth screamed in her head. That is how she felt. Love. Love for this ragged group of people who had taken them in, saved them. The wind ripped viciously at her face, blowing away the tears as they started to fall. Alan carried Shauna in his arms. Her little legs clutched tightly around his waist. She wondered how he could run with Shauna's full weight burdening him. He looked over at Jo Beth, planked between Jonah and himself. He told Adam and Carter that he wanted Jo Beth, Shauna, and Jonah with him. Adam did not like the idea of the 4 of them together. It would have been more reasonable for Jonah to go with Oliver and Tamara. No, Alan crossed his arms and glowered. His voice was steel and firm. There would be no opposition.
He comes with me, and so do Jo Beth and Shauna.
Adam nodded, giving in. There was no time to argue. The sheriff would be there at any moment, and they needed to get away. Sheriff Duncan Miguel was a cruel man who had been waiting for just this moment to get Adam and his crew behind bars. Adam shivered. They needed to get out of there fast.
All right, he goes with you, but be careful. You guys are gonna look like poppies in a field of daisies.
I'll take that chance, Alan replied, his face stone cold. They were running so fast, Jo Beth feared she would fall behind. Jonah firmly grabbed hold of her arm, helping her keep pace. She smiled at him and was thankful as they continued on. When dusk came, they stumbled into a field and fell asleep exhausted. Jo Beth woke to the sun shining on her face. For a moment, she was confused as to where she was. She sat up and faced Jonah, his elbows resting on his knees, and his index finger was playing with his front teeth. Rubbing the remainder of sleep out of her eyes, she stood up, feeling as though her legs would give out from under her. "Jonah," she said, her legs crying out in pain from the journey the day before.
Jo Beth,
he said with a weak smile. He stood up and came over toward her, gently taking her arm.
Legs a little wobbly from running?
It would seem that way. She grabbed his helpful hand. Wincing, she pressed her free hand to her spine.
You better try and walk it off, because as soon as Alan comes back, we'll be heading out again.
Where is he? She asked, walking in circles with Jonah. The pain in her legs was slowly turning into a dull throb.
He took Shauna out with him to hunt up some food.
Jonah searched the clouded sky with his eyes. Are you all right?
Oh, yeah.
Jonah grinned.
I just worry about the others. They my family is all. I hate to lose more family.
Jo Beth nodded. She understood more than he knew. They will be all right.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
They stood silently next to each other, Jonah holding JoBeth's arm protectively. Neither spoke for a long time as they stared at the endless field swaying before them. Alan and Shauna found them still standing in the same position. Shauna was giggling about the rabbit they caught together. When they came upon JoBeth and Jonah, they stopped for a moment, afraid to break the peace emanating from the two stone figures. Alan coughed, embarrassed, and sat down by the dead fire. He removed his hunting knife and began to gut the rabbit.
"What's the problem?"
he asked, trying to sound casual.
"Ah, nothing,"
Jonah said, breaking the silence. He bent down, grabbed a burlap sack beside the bundle of belongings, and removed some potatoes. The food had been divided into 3 portions before they had left the others. "Let's start a fire for that delicious rabbit you caught," JoBeth chirped to Shauna. Shauna jumped up, tiny wood chips clung to her dress, and she absently brushed them off as she skipped toward JoBeth. Alan watched from the corner of his eye as they disappeared into the tall grass.
"Winter is just about here,"
Alan said as he peeled the soft fur from the rabbit. He would keep it and make Shauna some mittens. Jonah nodded, not saying a word. He sensed Alan had something on his mind he needed to get off.
"JoBeth and Shauna need a home, a real home,"
Alan continued, never pausing in his butchering.
"I have to give 'em that." "You will. We both will,"
Jonah agreed while starting to peel potatoes.
"I have to,"
he said firmly, looking off into the horizon, lost in his thoughts. After a quick breakfast, they packed up the remainder of their food and started on their way again, this time walking. They were going farther from the people they loved and further into an uncertain future. JoBeth wondered about the rest of her new family. This continued to be in her thoughts as the 4 traveled on. Each time she awoke to the sun shining on her face, she wondered about them. Each time she fell asleep under the vast black sky with its many eyes glaring down at her, she wondered where the others were and if she would ever see them again. Wild Tamara, so angry and untamed. Oliver, with his piercing blue eyes and irresistible charm. Shy Todd, who barely said a word but always had a special pocket full of treats for a little 5-year-old girl. Carter, the shadow of his best friend, Adam. And Adam, the brave leader of them all. Were they all right? Did they sleep well last evening, alone for the first time in who knew how long? Did their fear match hers? She knew she would always worry about it, and she wished they were all safe and back together at the old abandoned house they had made a home.